This is the man who owns the moon. Well, apparently. But how does one own the moon? Some might think it's simple. You fly to the moon, you shrink the moon, and you grab the moon. It's a little bit more complicated than that. If you want to get technical on the matter, according to the Outer Space Treaty of 1967, the exploration and use of space shall be carried out in the interests of all countries. Outer space is the province of all mankind. This treaty is basically the rulebook for what countries can and cannot do in space, which includes planets, asteroids, yada yada yada. In brief, the rules aim to restrict those in space to do purely exploration, scientific endeavours, and anything for the advancement of mankind. Peace, prosperity, and certainly not something for commercial venture. That was generally the rule of play which they originally had in mind when it came to how people used and explored space. And one big cornerstone to this was the fact that they wanted to make sure that national countries and governments couldn't claim ownership of anything in space. So the treaty does just that. An agreement where everybody kind of agrees to say, this is owned by nobody. It is just kind of there. So, you'd think that such a treaty would cover everything. But unfortunately, there's always some savvy people that will try and get around this, try and basically show that they aren't subject to the rules. And that is what some people have tried to do in the past, particularly with the moon. Well, the important thing to note is that the treaty is aimed at ensuring no single nation can lay claim to space. So if Bob down the street wants to lay claim to the moon, then technically under the treaty, he's not a nation, he's a person. So can he claim ownership? Maybe. I mean, who the hell's going to stop him? I mean, it's not like anyone's on the moon right now, so Bob, you go ahead and claim that moon as your own. Cheese and all. You see, a whole host of companies and people have been trying to sell plots of land on the moon, and you'd be forgiven for thinking that this was people trying to get onto the ground floor of the next big investment, owning part of the moon and being there before anybody else. It's certainly an attractive offer. So, why not buy a piece of land on the moon? Well, the investment sounds a little bit too good to be true. Whilst this phenomenon in recent years has become more and more popular, where people might buy plots of the moon to basically have as a bit of a joke gift, the reality is that many of these things, and by many I mean if not all of them, have absolutely no legal authority or backing whatsoever. I mean, you could buy a piece of land for the moon, but what you're really buying is a piece of paper that says you, apparently, own a piece of the moon. And you know what, in my mind, I would think that most people that buy one of these gifts knows that's the case. They know that it's a bit of a joke and they don't actually own part of the moon. But then there's some people that actually do, and they genuinely believe that they have the legal right to own the moon. I mean, sure, Bob down the street has just sold you a piece of land on the moon and gave you a certificate for it. I mean, Bob wouldn't lie to you, would he? Because I'm sure international law would be on your side if it came down to enforcing the ownership of a plot of land that Bob down the street sold to you that one time. This sounds completely legitimate. The way these enterprises would get around the treaty is basically using a loophole that they aren't restricted by the treaty. But then there's been a whole host of people in history who have tried to lay claim to the moon, some in stranger ways than others. In 1996, German citizen Martin Jürgens declared that the moon belonged to his family, claiming that it had been presented to his ancestors in 1756 by Prussian King Frederick the Great as a gift of service. He made a petition to the German government at the time, but, as you might expect, he heard nothing further. Another example of this was a man called Dennis Hope, who created the Moon Real Estate Company, who tried to utilise the quote-unquote loophole. You know, the guy at the start of the video, Dennis Hope. This is the man here who apparently owns the moon, according to him. But how did he get away with this? What made him think that he could actually do this? I'm pretty sure it must have been a savvy business idea and just that light bulb moment that made you think somebody might believe me. So, our man Dennis wrote a letter to the United Nations and very boldly claimed he owned the moon and asked them for any legal reason why an individual could not claim ownership of the moon. Basically, he just waltzed into the United Nations and said, "Hey, countries of the world, that's mine up there, you can't do anything about it, and if you can prove it, then tell me otherwise." As you can imagine, he heard nothing. I guess this was the best way for him to try and legitimise his interest in the moon and raise this with the United Nations to try and gain some recognition. This, unsurprisingly, was never responded to. As well as telling them that he owned the moon, he also notified them that his intention was to subdivide the moon and sell plots of land via acre plots. He again heard nothing. So, by this alone, he thought, screw it, I'm just going to go ahead with it, sell the plots, as I've given you forewarning, you haven't come back to me, let's make some money, baby. So he went ahead and did just that, selling acres of land on the moon for $19.95, but it was actually $36.50 due to shipping, handling and something called lunar tax. If you think about printing money, then this is how you do it, folks. He would offer discounts for larger plots, but then again, what the hell is the tax actually for? This started back in the 60s, and after many years, he's actually claimed to have sold 611 million acres of land, which is insane. And I'll let you do the maths, but let me tell you, this guy is certainly doing quite well for himself. He even managed to sell plots to 3 former presidents, George H.W. Bush, Jimmy Carter, and Ronald Reagan. Do they know something we don't? I mean, Dennis proclaimed himself as the president of the galactic government, so perhaps that name title alone got him the recognition he needed to get through the doors to sell the plots of land to the presidents. You know, something to think about. The United Nations likely never responded because they probably assumed that the charter applied to individuals as well as nations, despite the fact that his claims to ownership were likely unenforceable in any event. He has made a shitload of money nonetheless. So if you want to get on board with this money-making venture and claim a planet yourself in which to sell land on, then sorry, but Dennis has already beat you to it. He also lays claim to many other planetary properties such as Venus, Mars, Mercury, Jupiter and Pluto. He's even offered to sell the whole of Pluto for the small sum of $250,000. Maybe if Pluto was a planet, you could throw a couple more zeros on the end of that. As to whether he's serious or not, who knows? I mean, at the end of the day, he's made a lot of money nonetheless, which is great. But the fact that he challenged China when they proposed that they were going to build a lunar base on the moon does maybe show that perhaps this guy's taking this a little bit more seriously than you first thought. Well, who'd blame him? If you've made that much money off this whole thing, why not carry it on and try and legitimise your claim as far as possible? Pretty genius stuff, if you ask me. Someone's going to need to keep that gravy train rolling. Many others have tried to make similar claims and ventures in the past, but none have been quite as successful as Dennis Hope, President of the Galactic Government and President of the best hustle of all time. If you guys liked that video, here's another one just like it. I'll see you guys in the next video. Fantastic.